父ものすごい嘘つき。
To proclaim to your average man that he is a liar is to cast doubt on his character. Worse even, it is to question his morality. And yet, the measure of a good spy, one worth their weight in salt, is the capacity to be a liar. In that regard, the statement by Anya is not an indictment of Twilight's morality, but the highest of praise. Praise because spies make for natural consequentialists. Consequentialism holds that the consequences of one's conduct are the ultimate basis for judgment about the rightness or wrongness of that conduct. And as such, a consequentialist is someone who believes that any action that produces a good outcome is morally right. The most popular branch of consequentialism is utilitarianism, which claims that action is best that produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. For a consequentialist, the cost and benefit of an action matter only to the extent that they affect the calculation of sum total happiness minus unhappiness. Consequentialist ethics is why being accused, as Twilight was by the narrator,
男は堂々とした嘘つきだった。
is praise. To lie is to violate another human by deceiving them into believing you hold something to be true when in actuality, it's the opposite. To ordinary people, violations such as these are immoral. For Twilight, however, a spy, as long as the outcome is good, the action is justified and moral. This consequentialist mentality is how Twilight excuses away his more mean-spirited behavior. From the less egregious time he told a woman,
君の話には知性を感じない。それじゃお幸せに。
to the more egregious times he offhandedly mentions returning Anya to an orphanage as if she were a toothbrush with damaged bristles needing replacing.
今からでも他の子に変えた方。
To Twilight, deceiving both these girls was not an action he would have liked to partake in, but nonetheless does so because that is what his ethics dictate of him. In his mission for world peace, the negatives of deceiving Anya and Karen are negligible and hardly worth a second thought.
ごめんよ彼。君たち親子にもう用はなくなった。
Words that Anya herself may one day have to hear in the same monotone and distant manner. If Twilight concludes that the sum total happiness minus unhappiness is greater by breaking the paternal promise he made when adopting Anya, then he ought to abandon his one-sided family. Given the tone of the story, I of course have doubts of the family splitting. Realistically, by the end, the Forger family will go from prototype to product. They will become a real family just as Pinocchio becomes a real boy. The occasional blood may fool you into thinking the story will delve into darker themes, and it might dip its toes. But at its core, it's a comedy, and it's unlikely the protagonist will engage in the sort of cruelty required in returning an orphan. Regardless of the future of the Forger family, the mere fact that Twilight would consider abandoning Anya as an option throws into question whether Twilight is a good person. More broadly speaking, as Katie Baker noted, can consequentialists who view individuals as mechanisms for maximizing overall happiness be good people? In this video essay, I would like to explore Twilight's morality in the context of consequentialist ethics and argue that being a consequentialist essentially means you are not a good person. Accusing Twilight of not being a good person is a rather bold stance, and no doubt many of you who agree with Twilight and the consequentialist ethics would accuse me of being too simplistic. After all, reality is cruel, and we often have to make difficult choices we may not want to make. In a better world, there would be no spies, no deceit, and no orphans to adopt. Alas, we do not live in such a reality. The reality we live in would be better off if we engaged in machine-like calculations. But we are not machines, and so that begs the question, what if the calculations are insufficient? Consequentialism requires one to calculate all consequences of each act for every person for all time. That's impossible. A fundamental condition of being human is cluelessness, and yet consequentialism requires us to have omnipotence. This is one of the reasons I am claiming Twilight and the consequentialists are not good people. They engage in borderline cruel behavior, all for an outcome they deem produces the greatest good. An outcome that is multivariate and far more complex than they can ever hope to compute. In other words, all the immoral deceiving Twilight engages in is not for a better outcome, but for the potential of a better outcome. To Twilight's credit, he does try to be prepared the best he can.
あらゆる事態を予測し、準備し、周到な計画に基づいて行動するのがスパイの鉄則。
The thinking is misguided, of course, because predicting every possible situation requires dealing with infinity. The consequentialist may make a counter-argument and claim that even though humans are indeed clueless for the most part, we do have enough clues to make educated guesses. Furthermore, consequentialists may claim we only care about the overall consequences and not the consequences of every little action. Otherwise, taking a step would become impossible because you would have to do computations on each step to determine if it will produce the best overall outcome for the greatest number of people. There is still a flaw in that argument, namely that educated guesses are more or less insignificant in the grand scheme of things. To illustrate the flaw, let's consider the scene where Twilight catches a robber and returns an old woman's purse. Twilight uses a couple of educated guesses, does the computation, and determines that the best course of action is to help return the old woman's purse. The educated guess he would make in this case is that there would be more happiness for a greater number of people if he catches the robber than if he does nothing. The multiple relevant parties who would be happy are the old woman who gets her purse back, the police who get a robber handed to them, and the onlookers who watch justice being served. The relevant unhappy party would be the robber. In this scenario, can consequentialists claim that educated guesses led to the best overall outcome? The answer is no, and it has to do with invisible consequences. Imagine if the old woman walks home right after getting her purse back and gets robbed a second time. This time, however, it turns violent and the old woman loses her life. Twilight or the consequentialist's initial calculation here would have been wrong, as it did not lead to the overall best outcome. All the happiness that had been gained from returning the old woman's purse is overtaken by all the unhappiness that results from the old woman's death. This is the dilemma for consequentialists. They can claim to sidestep the problem of having to calculate all consequences of each act for every person for all time with educated guesses, but ultimately, invisible consequences make it near impossible. Even the very genesis of the plot, Operation Strix, has an incomputable number of invisible consequences. For all Twilight knows, the very act of him spying on Desmond could make Desmond paranoid enough to actually start a war he would have otherwise never started. There is no real way of knowing unless you have a crystal ball. The information Twilight has at its disposal from which to make educated guesses about the future is as useful as the secret police knowing Twilight is under 7 feet tall. Since that is 99% of humanity, for all intent and purposes, it's useless. All this to say that consequentialists like Twilight are not good people because they justify harmful actions all for a perceived outcome they have no real method of hoping to compute. Truly good people do good for the sake of doing good and not for a perceived outcome. Just as there are those who agree with Twilight and the consequentialists, so are there those who do not. In fact, Loid, for one, would back me up on my claim that consequentialists are not good people. After all, if Twilight's actions, which are motivated by consequentialist ethics, were moral, and in turn, Twilight was a good person, why would he continually regret and express guilt over what he's doing? Oftentimes, he is regretful while he's engaged in the supposedly moral actions. There is a constant tension between Twilight the spy and Loid the man. Loid the man thinks deceiving is not moral, and he says as much himself.
女性を騙して交際するのは良くないと思うぞ。
Yet, Twilight the spy marries the girl while deceiving her. With Yor in particular, it's clear he does not engage in deception without a cost to his psyche. At one point, he suspects Yor of being part of the secret police and decides to do what his occupation entails: spy. Spying is his raison d'etre, or purpose of being, and it should come as naturally to him as assassination does to Yor. However, there is hesitation, and his mental state is in turmoil over the decision.
盗聴器を仕掛けるのはさすがにやりすぎか。いや、不安の目は積んでおかねば。
The hesitation is ultimately silenced by Twilight's consequential ethics, which step in and override any of Loid's concerns.
一瞬の油断が死に直結する。ひいては何万人もの生死に関わる問題だ。
The calculation for Twilight is straightforward. He should violate Yor's privacy, someone he's close with, because it will lead to the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So Twilight violates and Loid regrets. The regret comes from the fact that consequentialism, as Baker put it, forces us to put our commitments second, regardless of how strongly we are connected to them or how much pleasure we derive from them. The regret is built into the very foundations of consequentialist ethics, as happiness of the individual is overridden by the happiness of the masses. Baker also highlights the comedic irony in consequentialism, an ethics that promotes happiness yet requires this level of unhappiness from individuals. If one is willing to treat life as a numbers game, how can anything but unhappiness result? If someone is in danger, even if they are strangers, a good person blindly rushes to their assistance. Anya did not attempt to calculate the utility of rescuing a drowning boy. She did not pause to think about the potential stars she could have obtained. She rescues because it is instinctually the right course of action to take. When you have the option to do great good and you don't, that is something you will always come to regret. It will not just make others think negatively of you, it will also make you think negatively of yourself. Anya, unlike Loid, can sleep peacefully without regret, knowing she did good. Andrew T. Forsyth and Luke Saramu put it nicely. When considering to perform some act, you might wonder, when all is said and done, would I have the most reason to regret such an act? If the answer is yes, then perhaps you ought to refrain. In other words, if Twilight and the consequentialists were good people, then they would have nothing to regret. It is only because they are not acting like good people that they express regret over past actions. Twilight would be better off refraining from engaging in actions consequentialism dictates of him when they are in contrast to what Loid the man would like to do. But what if you don't refrain? What if one were to continually engage in regrettable behavior because the behavior is justified by their ethics? Well, it leads you to no other place than the secret police. If we were to assign an ethics to the secret police, consequentialism would be a natural fit. This is yet again another reason why I am claiming Twilight is not a good person. Just the word secret police alone invokes such utter disgust in most people. It's not hard to see why, with their proclivity for violence and torture. And yet, Twilight's mode of operation is indistinguishable from the secret police. Spies and secret police officers are on the same side of a coin. From the consequentialist viewpoint, the secret police is as justified to use violence as Twilight is to deceive, which is rather ironic that Twilight disguised himself as one of them. If Twilight was really on their side, he would also justify their use of violence. After all, according to them, the man they are trying to catch,
この国を混乱に陥れる悪の張本人です。うちの天敵と言ってもいい。
one can reasonably calculate the utility of torturing a few people, innocent or not, if it would prevent the world from falling into chaos. At one point, Yuri says, but conmen and spies always try to act like good people.
いやしかし、詐欺師やスパイは善人面するもの。
I would like to extend this and say that consequentialists also try to act like good people. They engage in harmful behavior, but believe what they are doing is moral. They have a rudimentary concept of justice, nothing beyond doing whatever makes the most people happy. When Anya was kidnapped for the first time, Twilight's immediate thought was something we would not attribute to a good person.
アーニャは子供の他にいくらでもいる。一から仕切り直して。
A consequentialist, however, would say that it's moral to abandon Anya in favor of another orphan. One little girl will always be insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Yet, to the dismay of Twilight the spy, Loid the man does not actually abandon her. Consequentialism was asking too much of him. It was an instance of Loid quieting his hyper-rational mind and truly being a good person. It is my hope that Loid's arc will entail a transformation from a consequentialist to someone who doesn't believe the end justifies the means. In other words, I hope to see his full transformation into a good person.